Year 10, it's Mrs. Tamisari here, and we've got another tutorial this week of Macbeth Act 2 Scene 3. Thought we'd try something slightly different and have me on the screen. Not that I particularly like appearing on the screen, but I thought it might help you remember that you do have a teacher behind these tutorials, and I do care, and I am still looking at your work, and I'm trying really hard to help you learn Macbeth, which is really difficult even in these complicated circumstances. So let's give it a try and see if it helps you at all. So we're going to look at Act 2 Scene 3. If I look away, it's because I'm looking at the PowerPoint at the same time as you. So if you haven't yet done so, you need to pause the video and read the scene through, because I'm going to assume that you've got a fairly good understanding of what happens in the scene. So if you haven't already done that, please pause the video and we'll come back in a minute. Okay, so having read the scene, let's just get an overview of what happens. So first of all, the porter answers the knocking at the gate. If you remember in Act 2, Scene 2, Lady Macbeth and Macbeth were disturbed by knocking at the gate, saying that somebody was arriving. And we talked about the fact that that symbolised justice and judgment coming from Macbeth. So this is immediately after the events of Act 2, Scene 2, and we almost leave Lady Macbeth and go to the gate just to see who's arrived. And we start with the porter answering the knocking, and he's drunk and he makes lots of jokes about dishonesty in society, which is very appropriate considering what's just happened. The people at the gate, the person who's knocking is Macduff, and Macduff and Lennox have arrived to collect Duncan, and so that's who's been knocking. And Macbeth fairly quickly appears from his chamber to greet them, and he's in his night clothes because he's giving the appearance that he's just been woken up. Macduff goes in to wake up the king and discovers the body. He discovers Duncan has been murdered. And so Macbeth and Lennox go into Duncan's chamber to check. And while he's in there, Macbeth stabs the guards to death. And so they can't now reveal anything about what happened or what they remember about the previous night. Lady Macbeth appears and is told what has happened, and Banquo also appears on the scene at this point. And then Malcolm and Donalbain arrive to see what the commotion is all about. And it's actually Macbeth that breaks the news to them about the murder of their father, and they ask who did it. And Lennox says that it appears like the guards have done it. And at this point, Macbeth confesses that he's accidentally murdered the guards. He was so enraged that he stabbed them to death. But Macduff doesn't really understand what Macbeth was doing here, and he questions him about it. And it suggests to us that maybe Macduff is wondering what's going on here, that there's something not quite right. Lady Macbeth pretends to faint then to distract Macduff and Banquo, and Banquo says that Lady Macbeth needs to be cared for, but that he himself is ready to seek justice, and Macduff agrees and sort of aligns himself with Banquo. Macbeth suggests that they all go off and get dressed, and that they meet together in the hall to make a plan about what they're going to do next. And Macbeth, Banquo, Lady Macbeth, Lennox and Macduff all leave, and that leaves Malcolm and Donalbain on their own on the stage to discuss the implications of Duncan's murder. And they agree together that they might be in danger if Duncan has been killed. It's clearly somebody trying to get the throne, and they are next in line. And so Donalbain says that he will run away to Ireland, and Malcolm decides he's going to go to England, and that's where the scene ends. Just want to say something about the spelling of Donalbain. Depending on which original version your copy is translated from, sometimes it's spelt Donalbain with a D in the middle, and sometimes it isn't. So either is fine. There was no standardised spelling when Shakespeare wrote Macbeth. Okay, so we're going to start with the porter and talk about what's going on in this section. And it seems very out of place considering what's just happened. We've got a porter who is basically the doorman. He's at the gate and he makes a series of jokes. It's a little bit like a stand-up routine. And it seems very out of place considering Duncan's just been murdered and all of the tension of the previous few scenes. So Shakespeare is basically trying to relieve that tension a little bit, and the porter offers a little bit of light relief or comic relief for the audience. And we can describe the porter as a comic foil. That means he's just a comedy character. And so what this section does is relieve the tension that's built from about Act 1, Scene 5 right up until now. And it almost sharpens the tension that's going to come in the rest of the scene. We have this little moment of relief at the beginning, and then Duncan's body's going to be discovered and it's all going to kick off again. So this section offers a little bit of relief so that the tension in the next section is heightened. It's also a really good opportunity for Shakespeare to use some satire. So if we remember the context, we're on the back of the gunpowder plot. And so humour here is used to make fun of people's stupidity or politics or current affairs. That's what satire is. It's a little bit like Mock the Week or Have I Got News for You, where the panellists make fun of things that have happened in the news during the week. And the porter's speech is full of satire. It's actually very clever. So even though he's quite a low status character, he's actually quite sharp and clever and makes a lot of very sophisticated humour. So what's going on then? The porter pretends that he is looking after the gates of hell. And it's ironic, it's full of dramatic irony, this, because he's got no idea about the influence of evil on the castle during the night, but the audience, of course, do. So that's dramatic irony. And it's important to note that he's still drunk after the celebrations of the previous evening. If you remember, there's a banquet happening to celebrate Duncan's victory in battle, and the porter has had a few too many and is still drunk, even though it's early the next morning. So he basically makes jokes imagining who might be at the gates of hell and making comments about what got them there. And all of them are comments about the politics and religious issues at the time. So it's all satire. He talks about a farmer, an equivocator and an English tailor. And there's layers of meaning in this, which we'll talk about in a moment. So first of all, he makes fun of a farmer who's arrived at the gates of hell. And this is a warning about greed. So what's happened is the farmer isn't just a farmer. He buys and sells corn trying to make a profit, like an early example of a stock exchange. And what's happened is that there's been a bumper harvest. And you'd think that that was good for a farmer, but in this case, he's almost gambled on the fact that the price of corn will be high, which of course, if there's a lot of corn because of a bumper harvest, the price is going to go down. And so he's lost a lot of money, and the result is that he's hanged himself. Now, suicide was considered a crime all by itself. It was known as self-murder, and so he's gone to hell because of that. And so the porter jokes that the farmer, he hopes the farmer's brought a lot of handkerchiefs with him because he's going to sweat a lot and he's going to have to mop his brow. So he's going to sweat in the fires of hell. So he makes a joke about a farmer. The next person he makes a joke about is an equivocator, and this is a warning about lying or deceiving. Now, an equivocator is somebody that tells half truth, so they don't lie, but they don't tell the whole truth. And the art of the equivocator is to appear to be on everybody's side. Depending on the audience, they'll change the truth that they tell in order to stay in everybody's good books. And so they change according to the circumstances in the audience. But the porter jokes that even though the equivocator is really skillful with words, he's not skillful enough to talk himself into heaven, and so he's been sent to hell. And if you notice, he says that the equivocator committed treason enough for God's sake. So he's there because he's committed treason. Thirdly, he makes a joke about the English tailor, and this is a warning about theft. Now, what's going on here is that tailors would often cut pattern pieces out of fabric a little bit tighter than they should be so that they could get more clothes out of the same piece of cloth, but they would charge the customer for the full amount of cloth. So the customer would get a pair of trousers and they'd be a little bit too tight and leave very little to the imagination, and the tailor would pocket the extra money. And so this is a warning about stealing, and this is quite a rude joke, really. He says to the tailor, "Come in to hell, here you may roast your goose." And he's making a joke about the person wearing the tight trousers having effectively their meat and 2 veg on show because their trousers are too tight, and so hell's far too hot for a man in very tight trousers. Here you may roast your goose. It's what we call a double entendre. It's got a double meaning, a little bit saucy. Finally, he jokes about Macbeth, and he says that Macbeth's castle is too cold for it to be hell, and he's suggesting here that Macbeth is a little bit stingy, a little bit mean, doesn't spend enough on heating. And so that's the end of that first phase of stand-up that the porter does. So what's really going on here? How is this satire? Well, first of all, if we look at the farmer and the equivocator, there is context to do with what was going on in British society at the time, but there's also context linking to Macbeth. So let's look at the social and historical context first. So first of all, there was a priest who was involved in the gunpowder plot, and his name was Henry Garnet, and his nickname was Farmer. And so there's a direct reference there to Henry Garnet. Now, he was told about the plot in the confessional. He was a priest, and one of the gunpowder plotters confessed to him that he was going to be involved in a plot to kill the king. Now, because it was in the confessional, the priest took that as a reason not to pass that information on. And so he equivocated, really. What he did do was write to Catholic leaders and encourage them not to use force in their fight for religious freedom. So he didn't directly help the plotters. He wasn't directly involved in the plot, but he didn't do anything to stop it either. And so that counted as equivocation. And in the porter's speech, the equivocator commits treason, and even though Henry Garnet didn't actively get involved in the plot, he didn't stop it, and so he was executed for treason in May 1606. Remember, this play was first performed in August 1606, so this is very, very current political and social events. Okay, so how is it a comment on Macbeth and Lady Macbeth? Well, first of all, Macbeth's main weakness is ambition, as we've talked about. And ambition is the greed for power. So in that way, he's greedy in the same way that the farmer that the porter talks about is greedy. Secondly, Macbeth and Lady Macbeth have lied and deceived, and they're going to carry on doing that through this scene. And so they're both equivocators. They don't tell the whole truth about what they've done. And thirdly, Macbeth is stealing the monarchy effectively. It's not rightfully his. The heir to the throne has been named as Malcolm. And so Macbeth is effectively a thief stealing the throne. And he's going to pass the cost of that crime onto his subjects, as we see through the rest of the play. Things do not go well in Scotland. And so in that way, he's like the English tailor. So we've got a double layer of meaning in these jokes. There's a social and historical meaning, but there's also a meaning within the play talking about Macbeth. So what we get here is our first meeting with Macduff, and our first introduction to him is that he's a stooge. He sets up the porter's jokes. He's like the straight man. So if you think about comedy double acts like Morecambe and Wise, Eric Morecambe was the comic foil and Ernie Wise was the stooge. He was the straight guy. He was pretending to be serious while the other half of the double act mucked about. And so this is what Macduff does. And so what we're seeing here is that Macduff has got a sense of humour. He's a good guy. He's also a man of the people because he doesn't consider himself to be so important that the porter is irrelevant to him. He hangs around and has a chat and talks to him and engages with him. And so it shows us that Macduff is quite a humble man. He's willing to treat everybody like human beings. He's not so full of his own importance that he ignores the porter. So he sets up the porter's next jokes, which is about the effects of alcohol. And the porter introduces the joke by saying that alcohol is a provoker of three things. And so Macduff falls into the porter's trap and asks the question, what three things? And so the porter delivers his punchline. Alcohol makes your nose go red. It provokes nose painting. It provokes sleep, because you get sleepy after you've had too much to drink, and it provokes urine because it fills your bladder and makes you need to go to the toilet. All right, so that's the joke, and although it might not make us laugh out loud, it is funny. It is meant to be funny. The second half of the joke, though, is much more amusing, and he goes on to make some bawdy jokes about the effect of alcohol on sexual performance. And bawdy means like slightly rude and a little bit blue. Okay, so what he says is that drink provokes and unprovokes lechery or sexual desire. So it makes you feel a bit frisky, but it takes away your ability to perform. And the particular punchline is the bit at the bottom there where it says drink makes him stand to and not stand to, and that is quite an obvious joke about not being able to get an erection. So that's I bet you wish I wasn't in the corner of the screen now. So that's the joke there. It is quite funny. So you need to remember at this point that theatre was for all the classes. It wasn't something just for posh people. And the groundlings were the poorest people in the audience. They'd pay a penny to get into the theatre, and they would have to stand up all through the performance. And they'd often be drinking. They'd be drunk when they came in. They'd be drinking through the performance, and they'd be standing right in front of the stage. And so they'd often be quite rowdy. They'd shout out. They'd engage with the audience. And Shakespeare often includes bawdy humour, even in quite serious plays like this, to keep those groundlings entertained. If you know Romeo and Juliet at all, you know that Mercutio also takes this role and makes some quite rude jokes, very rude jokes actually, all the way through the first part of the play. And it's a nod to the poorest in the audience. Okay, so the porter says that he was so drunk that he couldn't stand up for a while, so there's a bit more humour. And then Macduff ends this conversation and brings us back to the story. So before we move on to that, I want you to pause the video and do our first response task. And the question is, why does Shakespeare include the porter's speech? So you can talk about context there, you can talk about satire, you can talk about tension, you can talk about the audience, you can talk about the drama. There's all sorts of things that you can discuss in your response to that question. So pause the video and you can do that. Okay, so as we've said, Macduff brings us back to the story and reminds us that he is here for a purpose, and he asks if Macbeth's woken up, and Macbeth comes in at this point, and he says that Macduff suggests that it's the knocking at the gate that's woken Macbeth up. We know that he's not actually been to sleep. So notice that Macbeth doesn't greet them It's Lennox that speaks first, and Macduff speaks as well. And Macbeth is very almost monosyllabic. Good morrow, both. Not yet. I'll bring you to him. This is the door. And we've got to remember that this scene is following on immediately from Act 2, Scene 2. So Macbeth has only just murdered Duncan. And so he's still, all the things that were true in the previous scene about his trauma and his shock and regret is still true. He's still trying to deal with the voice that he heard and the curse that he believes has fallen on him. Look at the respectful greetings of Lennox and Macduff. Lennox calls him noble sir, Macduff calls him worthy thane. And it shows us that no one suspects anything, no one's expecting anything to be amiss in the castle. So they still believe Macbeth to be a good man. And Macduff is concerned that he's late. Now that lends even more importance to his conversation with the porter, because he's given the porter some time, even though he risks being late to wake Duncan up. And this shows us not just that he's a man of the people, but that he is conscientious and trustworthy. He's the one that Duncan has asked to come and get him, come into his room, wake him up and help him prepare for his onward journey. And so he's quite high up and very much trusted by the king. We've said Macbeth doesn't say much here. So Macbeth doesn't actually go in to the castle. Remember, he told us in Act 2, Scene 2 that he was scared to look again at Duncan's body. So he just shows Macduff the door. And I've got some quotes in the corner there just from the previous scene. He says to Lady Macbeth, "I'll go no more. I'm afraid to think what I have done. Look on it again, I dare not." So once again, we see that he's still suffering the after effects of the murder. He's still experiencing some sort of trauma after that event. So Macduff leaves the stage and goes into Duncan's room to wake him, and that leaves Macbeth and Lennox on their own. And Lennox describes the night that has just passed, and he remarks on the unnatural events that have been reported. It's quite an awkward conversation, really. It's like they don't know what to say to each other. And so Lennox just effectively talks about the weather. So the things that he notes are that there have been strong winds through the night and some chimneys were blown down. That there were eerie sounds on the wind. He says that lamentings were heard in the air and screams of death. And so the wind was making really strange noises as they journeyed to Dunsinane. He says that there have been reports of rebellion and chaos. And we've got to remember as well, the very beginning of this play, there is a lot of turmoil in Scotland. They've just been fighting a war because of a rebellion. And rumours have emerged that more rebellions are starting up again. So more chaos is happening. And he says that there was an owl that shrieked all night long rather than just early on in the evening. And there have even been reports of earthquakes. So he says the earth was feverish and did shake. So there's been quite an unnatural night going on. If all that was happening in the night, you would be pretty concerned about what was happening. Now, the context here that's important is that the murder of Duncan has broken the great chain of being, which we've talked about in previous tutorials. And the effect of that is that the natural order of things has been upset and nature is going to be in chaos now. And this is described as pathetic fallacy, when the natural world reflects the mood of the events or the characters. That's called pathetic fallacy. And so that's what Lennox is showing here, that the world is echoing the upset and the chaos that's been caused by Duncan's murder. Now, after this, Macduff returns from Duncan's chamber, and look at his extreme reaction. He comes out of the room shouting, "Horror, horror, horror, tongue nor heart cannot conceive nor name thee." He can't even bear to say what he's discovered. And Macbeth very casually, in comparison, says, "What's the matter?" And this is Macbeth pretending not to know what Macduff has found, even though he knows very well. So Macduff tells Lennox and Macbeth what's happened, and his language reveals how much loyalty and respect he has for Duncan. So first of all, he uses religious imagery. He says that the murder of the king is sacrilege, which is like a religious crime. And he uses this metaphor of Duncan being like a temple, a holy place, to describe what's happened. The temple, Duncan's body, has been broken open and the life of the building has been stolen. And so the extended metaphor here is suggesting that the crime is like equivalent to the robbery of a church, taken, somebody's broken into a church and taken probably the communion wine and wafers, which were thought to be the body and blood of Jesus. Macbeth continues to pretend that he hasn't got a clue. What is it you say? The life? I don't know what you mean. And so he's playing his part, but not saying very much. And Macduff adds another metaphor here. He says, "Go and have a look yourself and destroy your sight with a new Gorgon." And the Gorgons were characters from Greek mythology. Medusa was one, and they were horrible to look at. So Medusa is supposed to have snakes for hair and brass claws and things like that. And looking at a Gorgon would turn you to stone. And so the metaphor here is suggesting that the sight of Duncan's murdered body is going to have the same effect on them as looking into the eyes of a Gorgon. So Macduff, it's also important to notice, recognises and names the crime that is being committed. He calls it murder. And this is very different to Macbeth and Lady Macbeth. If you remember, they say the deed, and Macbeth uses the word assassination earlier on. But Macduff calls it what it is. Duncan has been murdered. So while Macbeth and Lennox are in Duncan's chamber, Macduff takes charge and he calls for the alarm bell to be rung, and he wakes up the house and he names people by name to call them to consciousness. And look at all the exclamations all the way through this. They create a sense of urgency. He wants action immediately. Macduff is going to reveal himself to be a man of action, and so his speech here shows that. So, response task 2, you can pause the video here. I want you to analyse how Shakespeare shows us that Macduff is a good man. And remember that the focus of the question here is Shakespeare, not Macduff. And so you need to look at the devices that Shakespeare has shown to show us what Macduff is like. And you can talk about dramatic devices as well as language devices here. So don't forget to use point, evidence, explain, link. Make sure you're mentioning methods that have been used and talking about the intended effect of those. Okay, so I'll see you when you've done that task. So at this point, Lady Macbeth appears, and she actually pretends to be angry at being woken up. So Macbeth's taken the, "oh, I don't know" approach. Lady Macbeth is taking the "what's going on" approach, and she seems a little bit sort of annoyed to having been woken up. Once again, remember, she hasn't actually been asleep. She's just been in her room waiting until an appropriate moment. And so when she comes out, look at the respect that Macduff shows to her. So she's come out just being quite abrupt, and he responds with "oh, gentle lady." And so even though she's greeted him in quite a rude way, he shows her total respect. And look at the irony here. Remember what the witches said at the beginning: fair is foul and foul is fair. And remember Lady Macbeth's words to Macbeth in Act 1, Scene 5, "look like the innocent flower, but be the serpent under it." And here we've got dramatic irony. We know that Lady Macbeth is far from a gentle lady, but Macduff doesn't know. So that line is loaded with irony here because we know what she's been up to. I also want you to notice how many entrances and exits there are in this scene. So we've got Lady Macbeth, we've got Banquo coming in. If we look on the next slide, we've got Macbeth and Lennox coming back out of Duncan's room. Ross comes out, Malcolm and Donalbain arrive. And there's lots of to-ing and fro-ing here. And it affects the action by creating chaos. There's so many people on the stage. They're all sort of going off and coming back on again. And if we compare this with that calm humour with the porter at the beginning of the scene, we can see how much tension has increased as the scene has progressed, and it lends more chaos and confusion because of what's happened to Duncan. So that's just worth noticing. Now, Lady Macbeth pretends to be shocked. Macduff tells Banquo, actually, not Lady Macbeth, what has happened. If you notice, he doesn't want to tell Lady Macbeth because he thinks it's going to kill her to hear that Duncan's been murdered. But he tells Banquo, and Lady Macbeth responds, but she responds with shock, but she's shocked at the wrong thing here. So when Macduff says, "Our royal master's murdered," she says, "What? In our house?" And that seems to be a really inappropriate response, and Banquo picks up on this immediately. He says it's too cruel anywhere. It doesn't matter where he was murdered. The fact that he has been murdered is what's awful. Now, the fact that he picks her up on that might suggest that he is suspicious, that this is not an appropriate response, and he finds that very strange. Maybe he's suspicious, maybe we're giving him too much credit, who knows. So then Macbeth comes back in, and Macbeth's speech carries on. Now that he's seen Duncan, he carries on with a superb example of equivocation. Remember, we said at the beginning that Macbeth is going to be equivocating all the way through this scene. So this is where Macbeth tells the truth, but not the whole truth, and he tells truth in a way that is appropriate to the people listening, that is going to make him seem innocent. And he says, if he died an hour ago, he'd have lived a happy life. Now, that sounds like he's sorry for Duncan's murder. He wished he hadn't lived to see Duncan's murder. But we know that he regrets murdering Duncan, and he wishes that he died before he committed the crime. And so this is him sounding like he's telling the truth and having a genuine response. But we as the audience know that he isn't. He goes on and says that life has lost all its meaning, that fame and honour are gone, and again, all of this is true for him, but not for the reason that it appears. And the problem here is that everything he says, he goes on and breaks the news to Malcolm and Donalbain, and he says the spring, the head, the fountain of your blood is stopped, the very source of it is stopped. Everything he says is too contrived. Now, contrived means a little bit fake. It sounds planned and rehearsed. It sounds like while he was in with Duncan, he has planned what he's going to say. And the effect of this is that he doesn't sound genuine at all. Now, as we've said, Macbeth is the one to break the news, and just compare the way that Macbeth breaks the news with Macduff. So Macbeth gives this very flowery metaphor, and Macduff says, your royal father's murdered. Now, on the surface, this might make it seem that Macduff is a little bit cold and harsh, but actually it's a far more genuine response to the murder of Duncan. Macbeth sounds really fake, and Macduff just says it like it is. And so we've got this very clear delivery of the news from Macduff, whereas Macbeth's is all flouncy and contrived. Now, Malcolm asks who murdered his father, and Lennox says it seems like the guards have done it. And so it appears that Lady Macbeth's plan has worked. The suspicion has fallen onto the guards, and that's what Lennox reports. But at this point, Macbeth drops a bit of a bombshell, and he confesses that when he and Lennox went in to see Duncan, he has killed the guards. And he says that it's because he was overcome by emotion and lost his head. But this wasn't the plan. And this is the first time that Macbeth has acted independently of Lady Macbeth. And we said in the last tutorial that Macbeth and Lady Macbeth are going to start breaking apart. Their relationship is going to move apart. And here he started acting independently, and he carries on behaving like this through the rest of the play, and it brings all manner of problems. Now, Macduff recognises that that's quite an odd thing for Macbeth to have done, to murder the guards that might be able to be questioned and give some information. Remember, there's a lot of sort of turmoil in Scotland, and so they could have asked who the guards were working for or whether it was part of a bigger plot. Macduff can't understand Macbeth's actions, and so Macduff is showing us here that he can sense something isn't right. He's on to Macbeth already. He can't understand why Macbeth's behaving the way that he did. And again, Macbeth goes on with this contrived, fake language. He uses a rhetorical question: who would have done anything other than that? Well, Macduff didn't do it, and Lennox didn't do it, so the question answers itself. He's saying that Duncan's murder has made him lose his head, which again is equivocation. It has made him lose his head, but not for the reason that he presents. Look at his language. He's almost borrowing Macduff's language here. He uses loads of religious imagery to talk about Duncan. He talks about Duncan's silver skin, his golden blood, that it's a breach in nature. And so he is suggesting that he thinks about Duncan in the same way, but he's just taking on language that he's heard. He also, though, uses quite a lot of gory imagery. So he talks about blood, gash stabs, a breach in nature, steeped in the colours of their trade, so the guards being covered in blood, breach with gore. And this combination of the two sets of imagery shows us the conflict in Macbeth's conscience and his mind. On one hand, he still loves Duncan and regrets what he's done, but on the other hand, he's quite brutal. And what we've got here is the soldier coming out. As we've said, his speech is too clever and contrived. He's gone from being monosyllabic at the beginning of the scene to having these really elaborate metaphors. And remember what Lady Macbeth said to him in Act 1, Scene 5. She said, "Your face, my Thane, is as a book where men may read strange matters." And Macbeth is talking far too much and is starting to look suspicious and give himself away. And so Lady Macbeth intervenes. She faints. Now, we could suggest that the shock of Macbeth's actions makes her actually faint. She can't believe that Macbeth has started operating independently. But I think a more likely suggestion is that she fakes it because she wants to distract attention away from Macbeth. Macbeth is about to give the game away, and so she pretends to faint to distract everybody, and it works. So Macduff pays attention to her. And while they're all fussing over Lady Macbeth, Malcolm has an opportunity to speak to Donalbain secretly. And if you notice the word aside in the stage directions here, that means that the other characters on stage aren't supposed to be able to hear what these two are saying to each other. Now, Malcolm knows that he didn't kill his father, and so he recognises that he and his brother might be in danger. Whoever's killed Duncan is after the throne, and Malcolm and Donalbain are still in the way. Malcolm is the heir, and if Malcolm is murdered, Donalbain will be the heir to the throne. And so they recognise that they are in the firing line. And Donalbain agrees with him and suggests that they run away. And so attention is back again Banquo starts speaking, and so their conversation is interrupted. Now, Banquo brings our focus back to the murder, and he encourages everybody to investigate the crime that has happened, and he warns people about the effect of fear and doubt. Now, I think all of this suggests that Banquo knows that the murderer is probably still among them, and so he's warning people to not let their preconceived ideas about each other affect their judgment. And he aligns himself with God. He says, "In the great hand of God I stand," and he commits to fighting against the secret murderer. He's going to do everything he can to bring justice. And Macduff aligns himself with Banquo. He says, "So do I." Now, Shakespeare is helping us here. First of all, notice Macbeth's silence throughout this exchange. So he's obviously taken the hint from Lady Macbeth and has shut up and isn't saying anything. But Banquo has taken the lead. And the reason I think Shakespeare does this is that he's built up Banquo's character over a number of scenes now. We know that we can trust him. We know that he's a good man. But we've only just met Macduff, and so Shakespeare is showing us that Macduff is just like Banquo. We can trust Macduff because he's on Banquo's side, and so Shakespeare is bringing those two characters together because Banquo is going to die in the next couple of scenes. And so we need somebody who's going to carry on the fight for justice through the remainder of the play. And so this is almost Banquo handing on the baton to Macduff. So Macbeth suggests that they meet together in the hall, and off they all go. Everybody leaves the stage except for Malcolm and Donalbain, and we get this last little bit of conversation between them. So Malcolm knows that he can't trust everyone that's there. And he says that it's really easy for the guilty party to pretend to be sad to cover their guilt. And it's the first sign that Malcolm has got wisdom, because the most vocal person about their shock and horror has been Macbeth. And so the hint here is that Malcolm suspects Macbeth, and he is the rightful king now that Duncan's dead. And so Shakespeare's helping us see that Malcolm has some of those kingly qualities, that he's not just a silly boy. He's got some wisdom. He's got some of his father's qualities. Malcolm says that he's going to run to England, and Donalbain says that he's going to go to Ireland, and they agree that they need to separate because that will keep them safer. If they're together, they can both be killed at the same time, so it keeps them safer. Look at Donalbain's metaphor here. He says there's daggers in men's smiles, and this is Donalbain showing that he knows that people can't be trusted. And remember Act 2, Scene 1, where Macbeth had the vision of the dagger, and so we've got an echo here. There's daggers in men's smiles. There's an echo here of the man who saw the dagger, who was led by the dagger. And Donalbain says something very wise as well. He recognises that their closest relatives are the most likely to be guilty. He says the nearer in blood, the nearer bloody, the more likely murderer is the one that's closest to them by blood. And so we've got to remember here that Macbeth is the only other character that's been identified as being a blood relation of Duncan. And so the suggestion in this little exchange is that both of them suspect Macbeth. Malcolm says that he knows that the murders aren't over. This is just the beginning. He says the murderous shaft that shot has not yet lighted. So the arrow that's been fired hasn't landed yet. And so he knows that he's the next one that's going to get killed. But he's also sort of foreshadowing all the death that's going to happen in the remainder of the play. And he encourages Donalbain not to say goodbyes, just to go. They're going to sneak away and not tell anyone. He says, let's not be polite in leaving, let's just go. And it shows us how afraid they are. And so that's the end of the scene. So here's our response task. How does Shakespeare use Act 2, Scene 3 to foreshadow the events in the rest of the play? And although we haven't looked at the rest of the play, you do know the plot, so you can you can make some judgments about foreshadowing and the way that the events of this scene point to what's to come. So what's important about this scene? First of all, we're getting to know Macduff. We're seeing that he's a good man, he's a man of the people, he's just like Banquo. And Banquo's handed the baton on. We've also seen that Macbeth is acting independently of his wife and doing his own thing, and that's going to increase as the play continues. And we've also seen that there are possibly 4 characters that already suspect Macbeth. That's Macduff, who's concerned about Macbeth's actions in killing the guards; Banquo, who is concerned about Lady Macbeth's inappropriate shock; and Malcolm and Donalbain, who know that they didn't murder Duncan, and so probably somebody close to them has. And so we've got 4 characters that are already suspicious, and things are going to unravel from this point on. So that's the end of our tutorial. I hope you found that helpful. Look for the task on Frog and upload your responses, and I'll see you in the next tutorial. Bye.